Hello, my name is Ian Hawkins. You are listening to The Why Word, the podcast that gets under the skin of artists, creatives, thinkers, business people, CEOs, basically anyone who makes a difference in the world and tries to find out why they do what they do. Coming up in today's show, you're going to hear this.
Bowie was forever alive to new beats, new sounds, new textures, new colours that were emerging in music at any point during his career. But it never felt like it was a gimmick or something he was putting in because that's what the kids are into, that's what's down at the moment. It always felt like it was coming through as an organic part of his soul speaking. And the very greatest artists are capable of that. It's Alex Ferguson, former great manager of Manchester United, who described the symphony orchestra as being the perfect team. He got taken to see the orchestra play live. He'd never seen an orchestral concert before. And he was slack-jawed at the depth and the breadth and the sophistication of the teamwork. When an orchestra is on fire, it feels like there is infinite freedom for every single musician on that stage. I'd like to see a Me Too movement for men like me now. The Me Too movement has been such an incredible, game-changing movement for change. And thank God for it, and we need more and more of it, because the monstrous behaviours of patriarchal figures going back since the dawn of time has to stop. That cycle has to cease.
Charles Hazlewood is a conductor and the artistic director of Paraorchestra, the world's first integrated ensemble of disabled and non-disabled musicians. His career highlights include films on Mozart, Beethoven and Tchaikovsky for the BBC, and he was recently a castaway on Desert Island Discs. Charles Hazlewood, I'm so sorry I'm not Lauren Laverne, but notwithstanding, welcome to The Y Word.
Thank you very much, Ian. Good to be here.
It's lovely to have you, because one of the questions that I want to talk to you about, it's about classical music or orchestral music, is seen as quite elitist and maybe not all that relevant today. So you would definitely disagree with that, wouldn't you?
Not necessarily. What I wouldn't disagree with is the strange world that's grown up around it, which, as you say, you just use the word elitism. There's a sense that the aficionado to classical music is a kind of hermetically sealed club, of which only a certain type of person is allowed to gain entry. There's a sense that when you go into the ivory tower of a concert hall, if you don't know what the rules of engagement are, the rules of behaviour, where to clap, how to clap, these are all kind of slightly punitive measures designed in a way to keep the whole culture within this kind of club of people who know what's appropriate. And that I lament on a daily basis, because music, in the broadest way, is the most universal language we have. So why you should hive off a really important part of music into a place where only a certain type of person feels comfortable is beyond me. So in that regard, the elitism stinks, and I will do everything in my life to change that.
So how does this image problem happen?
If you cast your mind back to the 18th century, actually, I think it's true to say that concerts were much more then like circus or like a rock and roll gig. In other words, people would turn up, any kinds of people, anyone who had the very small amount of money required to buy an entrance ticket. And then there'd be a lot of talking and laughing and drinking and card playing whilst there was some musical entertainment going on. And of course, if the musical entertainment was really good, then you'd hear a pin drop. People would be focused on it. Because at the end of the day, anything that's really good will draw people's focus, will draw people's attention. You don't need to tell people how to behave when they're listening to music. If the music is good and it's performed with complete authenticity and integrity, they'll shut up and listen. These kind of bourgeois conventions have grown up around it. It's become a bit like the Church of England. It's a place where you have to behave in a certain way. You have to wear a certain type of clothing. You need to have knowledge pre the event so that you'll react in what's considered to be the appropriate way to the music. All of this stuff has grown up around it, which of course is nothing to do with the music itself, nor indeed to do with the orchestra, which is the most universal and in fact actually the most perfect team, the most universal team that exists in human experience, upwards of 100 people playing in perfect synchronicity. That's got to be a wow factor, hasn't it?
It has, because most of us have the experience of picking up an instrument and making a horrible noise with it as children. You would think that hearing everybody doing it absolutely brilliantly, we'd appreciate it more than maybe we do.
I think that's right. And of course, there's another funny factor in all of this. People say, oh, no one goes near the orchestra anymore. Well, that is not true, because the orchestra is alive and well and very present in the front room of pretty much every person on the planet by dint of movie scores, video game scores. So people are constantly being exposed to the orchestra. It's just they're not necessarily going to the rather smart and rather expensive looking concert hall up the road because they don't necessarily feel comfortable there. So one of the reasons why I've made a real priority out of taking my orchestras to play festivals like Glastonbury is because there you're meeting people in a totally level playing field kind of environment. You've got every kind of person there, young, old, drunk beyond all reasonable standards. But the point is that they're engaging with the music in whatever way feels good to them. There are no rules, right? There are no expectations of a type of clothing. They are what they are. The music is what it is. The environment is what it is. And to me, that's a much more natural tribe for the orchestra than those you'll find in serried ranks in rather a tight and stiff concert hall environment.
It strikes me as very unfair, Charles, because I watched Hamilton on Disney+. I don't know if you've seen Hamilton, and if you've tried to get tickets for it, how phenomenally expensive it is. And it's also an incredibly popular thing. I don't think I can quite cope with opera being called elitist because it costs a lot to get in, when Hamilton is not elitist and costs maybe more. And
goodness me. I mean, how much does it cost to go to a Premier League football match? And people don't call football elitist. No, I agree with you that the price band is not necessarily the biggest barrier to attendance. It's about all these other things that I've been outlining, which are to do with it being a closed-off club that only a certain type of person feels comfortable in.
But then you look at the subject of a lot of opera. You have the Beggar's Opera, which is 1720, whatever it is. Thank you, yeah. And that's why we have you on, Charles, for your expertise.
I just happen to know that piece really well.
And we have La Bohème, which is about penniless artists. So there's an interesting relationship between the top class that are going to it and the bottom class that are subject of it.
You know, when the Beggar's Opera smashed, sort of exploded on the London scene in 1728, as you said, I think the reason why it was such an overnight success was that the aristocracy, who were the people who went to the opera, were really titillated because it seemed like for the very first time in the history of operatic form, they were witnessing an entertainment, but where the protagonists were all low-born mucky buggers doing low-born mucky shit to each other. You know, it was about highwaymen and gangsters and prostitutes. And this seemed incredibly titillating because opera up until that time had always been about mythical deities, or at the very least about kings and queens and lords and ladies. So it was a real gear shift. John Gay was a bit of a genius in bringing that to bear. And you're right. I mean, you know, many of the greatest operatic stories since have been about people in penury, people at the very lowest end of the food chain and the kind of social pyramid. That certainly hasn't turned away the lords and the ladies from attending in their great numbers.
I think it's a line from Amadeus, isn't it, where Mozart is moaning about having to write operas about gods. And he says, why should I keep going on and on about it? And then I think the emperor says, well, because they do, and they're here to ennoble us, you as much as me. Film scores are kind of where it's at with orchestral music right now. So if you take something like the Lord of the Rings music, which has now been turned into a symphonic suite that the composer now tours around fancy music halls, are we still going to be listening to Lord of the Rings in 100 years' time? That
is, of course, a very good question. I'm not sure. I'm not a particular fan of Howard Shore's scores for those movies, in honesty. I don't think he's one of the greats. I think Morricone was, recently departed, one of the absolute greats. But arguably the greatest genius of them all, in my opinion, was Bernard Herrmann. Absolute rampant genius, with his feet so firmly in the soil of 19th and early 20th century orchestral musical development. He really understood all of those worlds and could use or not use elements of a Holst or a Stravinsky or a Brahms or a Debussy at whim, because he had all of those, as it were, tools in his toolbox. Whether we'll be listening to Lord of the Rings in 100 years, I rather hope not, because I don't think it's good enough music to sustain the test of time. John Williams, pretty much any score he ever wrote, absolutely, I would hope that we'd still be listening to that stuff, just as I hope we'll still be playing Bernard Herrmann. I think quality will always out in the end, won't it?
I'm thinking about how clever Bernard Herrmann is. Obviously, there's the psycho stabby bit, but then there's, if you think about North by Northwest, where it's the story of a man sort of pulled out of his life and set somewhere else, and there's something about the music which it just suddenly goes from being thinking fairly rigid 4/4 time into this onto the offbeats, and it just works.
Yes, such a genius. I mean, I don't know if you remember the score for Vertigo, which I think for me is one of his very, very greatest scores. That whole score is about like the disease that exists within the most intense kind of love so often. The whole score is built out of 4 notes. But then you look at a film like Taxi Driver, quite late Herrmann, And the way that he harnesses a kind of smoky downtown blues/soul/jazz scene and makes it part of his orchestral underlay, you know, like David Bowie, actually. Bowie was forever alive to new beats, new sounds, new textures, new colours that were emerging in music at any point during his career. But it never felt like it was a gimmick or something he was putting in because that's what the kids are into, that's what's down at the moment. It always felt like it was coming through as an organic part of his soul speaking. And the very greatest artists are capable of that.
And of course, the Paraorchestra did the Heroes suite by Glass, didn't they, at the
Heroes Symphony? Yes, that's right. That was a wonderful moment. In fact, I'm very proud of that occasion because that's literally the first time an orchestra has ever headlined a main stage at Glastonbury. At midnight on the Saturday of Glastonbury in 2016, which of course is the year Bowie died. Bowie is one of those artists one assumed would go on forever. So when I was talking with Nick Dewey, who runs Glastonbury with Emily Evis these days, I said to him, how would it be if we looked at celebrating or marking Bowie in a slightly tangential way, rather than just having some kind of big tribute act, you know, with a load of famous people coming on and singing Ashes to Ashes or Space Oddity? Wouldn't it be more interesting to take another great artist with whom Bowie was very close? And why don't we play Philip Glass's rarely performed Heroes Symphony and make that our moment when Glastonbury stops to remember this absolutely unique iconoclastic artist called David Bowie? So at midnight on the Saturday of Glastonbury that year, and you know what Glastonbury is like by midnight on the Saturday, everyone is struggling to remain alive, shall we say. And it was raining. And yet there we were with a capacity crowd, an absolutely packed, enormous field full of people standing in absolute silence while this very delicate piece of orchestral music played out. It doesn't have any big fireworks or, you know, drums and alarms to it. It's a very meditative piece. And yet you could have heard a pin drop from start to finish. So that was a special moment. That felt like a moment when we were taking the orchestra back to people.
For me, Charles, it always comes back to soundtracks. I have
right, fair enough.
I have Ennio Morricone's Strength of the Righteous on my running playlist. I do have a bit of Lord of the Rings on my playlist, and I also have The Buddha of Suburbia on my playlist. And when I play it to diehard Bowie fans, they go, "That's niche."
Bowie was brilliant at just sort of shedding his skins. He's chameleon-like, I suppose.
He feels like an actor who learned who made the method part of his music world. I don't have the vocabulary for this interview. As you can hear, this is one of those conversations that was always in danger of falling off the rails at any given point. Now, I like to think of myself as fairly sophisticated in my understanding of how orchestras work, but I was astonished by how many times I would put something to Charles and he would just say, "No, you're completely wrong about that." Well, I guess that's one of the benefits of this podcast, is you do find out stuff you didn't know about stuff you thought you did know about. So I thought for my next question, let's get back to basics. What does a conductor actually do? And my answer to that is they don't play an instrument themselves, they merely direct the orchestra into what they want them to do. And of course, as Charles was pleased to point out, that's kind of not quite it.
Well, first to say is that I do play an instrument, and the instrument is called the orchestra. So rather than it being a tangible box of wood or a column that I blow air down, I move air around, if you like. I move air around within a confined space, the length of my arms. And the instrument I'm playing is this extraordinary team of people. In fact, it was Alex Ferguson, former great manager of Manchester United, who described the symphony orchestra as being the perfect team. He got taken to see the orchestra play live. He'd never seen an orchestral concert before. And he was slack-jawed at the depth and the breadth and the sophistication of the teamwork. When an orchestra is on fire, it feels like there is infinite freedom for every single musician on that stage. In this complete perfect synchronicity, like the most perfect synchronized swimming, there still should be an infinite freedom for every individual to bring their particular unique talents to bear. So you said earlier also that the conductor is in charge. Not really. The conductor, if they're doing their job well, is simply partly an architect, but more than that, I'd say like a facilitator. My job when I start a project with any orchestra is to arrive at the first rehearsal with a tremendously strong sense of the outer architecture of a piece of music, where its highs are, where its lows are, where we're aiming for at any one point, where are the goals along the way, what's the ultimate goal. So if I've got that really clearly and sort of pristinely, precisely configured in my head, I can then create this sort of an environment, an architectural environment in a way, which is strong, tensile, but ultimately creates endless freedom. It's a safety place, a place of safety for every orchestral musician. They need to feel safe, and then they can fly to the stars and back. And the magic of it in practice is that I can play a Beethoven symphony with an orchestra in London on a Tuesday, and I can play the same Beethoven symphony with an orchestra in Stockholm on the following Saturday. Now, I haven't changed in those intervening days. My relationship with that symphony hasn't changed. Indeed, the symphony itself hasn't changed. But if I'm doing my job properly, I will get two completely different experiences of that symphony, because there's one unique bunch of people in the orchestra in London and another very different bunch of unique people in the orchestra in Stockholm. So, for instance, this Swedish orchestra I'm thinking of, they've got an astonishing woodwind section. Astonishing. And there are particular stars within that woodwind section. I'm talking flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, who've got such particular qualities that whenever I play with them, they reveal like a whole new world of possibility, even in a piece that I've done hundreds of times in the course of my career. So it's a really remarkable job, which is about basically not limiting people. The worst conductors are the conductors that sort of tamp things down and kind of restrict the musicians. And orchestras hate that. And God knows there's a lot of conductors that do that. It's about ego. It's about how it's going to make them look good. Well, I know that I will look a hell of a lot better if I can free up everyone around me and create a sense of collegiate trust, mutual support, listening, and tolerance and empathy and kindness and love across the giant horseshoe of musicians. If all of those characteristics and factors are in place, then literally you fly to the stars on a daily basis.
I think there's a piece called Carmina Burana that does that, where everybody seems to have a moment where they shine and do something extraordinary. There's like one incredibly long note on a trumpet, or there's a tenor who has to sing an octave above where he normally would. And that's just fascinating, because you can sit there and go, oh, I know what it sounds like when you do it right, but here's everybody going right to the edge. And Carmina Burana, I think, is my piece that people need to listen to. Yes,
it's amazing. It's amazing. And I think you put your finger on something there, that if, as I was saying earlier, if the conductor has calculated right and has created that environment which feels safe but also absolutely free, then everyone is in their element and they will then play off the dial. You know, in Spinal Tap, when they talk about the amplifier and the interviewer says, why does your amplifier volume knob go up to 11? Most amplifier knobs go up to 10. And he says, well, you're at number 10, you just want that little bit extra, you go up to number 11. And I would say that when an orchestra's on fire, they're all at 11, if not 12 or 13. It's thrilling, beyond belief.
And actually, Carmina Burana is the one that I say you do need to see live, because I haven't heard a recording yet that quite gets it.
No.
You've spoken out about your experience of sexual abuse. Silence is the weapon of the abuser. And so it occurs to me that you've spent your career not being silent. And is that something that you've realised looking back?
I think there's definitely a correlation there. I mean, I'm very aware, and it sort of pains me to say it, but I'm very aware that other people like me, and I include myself in this, have probably worked twice as hard as perhaps they would have worked had they not had that childhood trauma. It's almost like it's a stain you carry around, a stain on your soul, an indelible one. So, of course, my way, and the way of many other abuse survivors, my way of surviving that stain, or of at least in part, not really rubbing it out because you can't, but creating layers of goodness, of good tissue over the top of that stain, is by being very, very driven. And I'm very fortunate that music happens to be my medium and musicians happen to be my tool, if you like. So, yes, I'm very aware that the experiences I had as a child, they didn't destroy me. They could easily have done. But music has been the thing that saved me. And it's also been the thing which has lifted me up. And I would say that my greatest performances have been the ones when we're all at 12 or 13, as I was saying earlier, in terms of like over the scale intensity of commitment and determination. In those moments, I'm truly free of any trauma, of any damage that, like what was done to me when I was a kid. So I think it's amazing. And of course, you find in music many, many examples of great composers who had at least similar childhood stories to mine. Beethoven is one I call to mind. Beethoven had a violently abusive alcoholic father, and there may indeed have been some sexual abuse in there as well. We're not entirely sure. Beethoven, of course, he started to lose his hearing. Can you imagine how traumatic that is if you are a musician and you are less and less able to hear the detail the top range, the bottom range of the music that you're writing. Plus the fact, it seems quite clear to me that Beethoven developed a whole... he sort of started to edge onto a spectrum. I would say that there's a good evidence that he had a kind of social communication disorder, which meant that not only was he going deafer and deafer, but he found human interaction incredibly difficult. So what a double whammy of impairment. Now, no question, directly a correlation to what happened to him as a child, that damage was done, and that was the upshot from the damage. But the point I'm making is my relationship to his music and what I see in his music, I recognize. There's something about his music that has always spoken to me, that has always kind of like reached into my soul. And I think it's this common ground we share. I recognize a similar kind of obsessive compulsive aspect to the way that he conceives music, the way he works a theme, which totally speaks to me. So, you know, trauma in childhood, of course, has in many, many instances down the centuries made for great art. Now, as I say, I feel uncomfortable saying that because, of course, we'd much rather no one had any of the trauma. We'd much rather rub the trauma out. But if it's there, it has had some extraordinarily powerful upshots, should we say.
I do wonder if sometimes seeing our lives reflected back to us by people that are not, we would say nowadays, neurotypical, which Beethoven probably wasn't. But by seeing our own experiences reflected back to us, we do see something of ourselves in that, and it gives us a more objective view of ourselves in some way. Does that make any sense?
Definitely makes sense. And in fact, I think the composers and the music that I feel most in my flow with or most drawn to is music which has qualities. It may not be about that the person who created it having had similar childhood trauma, maybe not at all. In order for music to really flow through you, there has to be something about it with which you absolutely identify. It may be that you want to kill it, that you're in a kind of conflict with it, which of course also can be very creatively stimulating and can have interesting and positive results. You might be fighting against it, you might be completely in sympathy with it, or somewhere in between. But yeah, definitely one's own experience, the patterning of one's own life inevitably feeds into and allows you to make the choices you make, I suppose. There's certain composers whose music I'm much more naturally in sympathy with and like to perform. Some composers I can't quite grasp. I mean, what's become clearer and clearer to me, I suppose, is the only reason why I decided to go public on it, on Desert Island Discs, and to speak about it in the public for the first time was because it comes at the tail end of about 15 years of very hardcore and intense therapy and healing and recovery that I have been through and have kind of emerged from. And so the reason for wanting to talk about it is, well, first and foremost, because in so doing, I pray that I can encourage other people to find the words to articulate the experiences, because this stuff is buried deep down in the cellar of your soul. And you might think you can lock it away and ignore it your whole life long, but it will end up eating you up. So somewhere, at some point along the way, you have to find a way of articulating it. And like any issue of mental health, the more we talk about these things, the more we might start to unravel what it is in our culture that allows this stuff to go on, why it continues to perpetuate generation on generation. I mean, look, it's all well and good, catching a child abuser and trying them and putting them in prison. Of course you have to do that, but that's not going to get rid of the problem. We're only going to start to unravel and rub out the problem by looking at the root causes of it. Were they abused themselves? What particular characteristics or qualities or experiences in their life have led them to this point of madness? And it's only exploring and understanding those things that at least would mean that man would never do it again. I think throwing them in jail, you're just stigmatizing them, but you're not rewiring them. It's about the most corrupting and monstrous thing any human being can visit on another. But the kind of black and white notion that just by throwing them in jail, punishing them, that we will rub out paedophilia in our culture is like kind of cuckoo land to me. I mean, I'd go so far as to say I'd like to see a Me Too movement for men like me now. The Me Too movement has been such an incredible game-changing movement for change, and thank God for it, and we need more and more of it, because the monstrous behaviors of patriarchal figures going back since the dawn of time has to stop. That cycle has to cease. And by the same token, I think there are so many men like me who are buttoned down and shut down, but basically deeply traumatized by similar things that occur to them, until such time as they feel able and not ashamed to speak out. the problem won't even begin to be addressed.
Let's move on to my last question, which is what I always ask Charles, which is you're allowed to have a business lunch with anybody you like, alive, dead, fictional or real. Charles Hazlewood, who is your business lunch guest?
Well, seeing as you just pinned me with this question, off the top of my head, I think the person I would most like to meet right now, this second, would be Michelle Obama. And it's my greatest sadness that it's quite clear she absolutely has discounted the possibility of running for office of president. I think she is one of the single most great causes for optimism, for upliftment, for inspiration in the world. When you watch her talk in a school for teenage orphans in India, or you see her at a book signing somewhere, there's a grace to her and a humanity and a decency and a courage and a brilliance, a sharpness of intellect. She genuinely believes in a utopian world order where there is absolutely level playing field, where there aren't class systems, where there isn't rich and poor, there isn't privilege and non-privilege. This isn't cloud cuckoo land. This isn't like some kind of fantasy which the world could never be. The world could genuinely be that. And look, one thing I believe very strongly is that now we're in the midst of this kind of dreadful pandemic off the back of Brexit, Trump, and all the other kind of really strange and destabilizing events and factors in the last few years. We have to believe, or at least I have to believe, we're approaching the very end of a cycle. It's a many centuries old cycle, and that something new and much more hopeful will emerge. It's Greta Thunberg, it's the Me Too movement, it's women like Michelle Obama, that we might just be glimpsing something where we no longer punish the planet, where we no longer punish each other. And I just feel I would have such a field day talking about all of these issues with Michelle Obama, and obviously inflaming her with the idea of the Paraorchestra at the same time, because I know she'd absolutely eat it up for breakfast.
Charles Hazlewood, thank you very much indeed for coming on The Y Word.
You're welcome. Speak again sometime.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
As I go back over this recording with Charles Hazlewood, I'm just overwhelmed by the candour and the honesty that he gave us in that interview. And I'm so grateful that he was able to spare a little bit of time and talk through life, the universe and Beethoven. I think there's a really profound message in there about teamwork. And if you look at a score of music, it's like a process where everybody has their part to play. Everybody has their contribution. And I guess what I feel is that a lean Six Sigma person would come in and go, well, wait a minute, the double basses don't play for 2 pages. That's redundancy. We can get rid of that. We can get rid of this. And that, of course, wouldn't honour the original concept of the piece of work as the composer intended. I think at this moment too, we're all seeing how there's not enough give in the systems we've all become used to. There's not enough of a buffer, and businesses are falling over left, right and centre because there's just not enough in the tank to get them through the hard times. And maybe that's a result of economising so much, it removes the ability to be flexible when things don't go according to plan. You're smart, you draw your own conclusions. Thanks again to Charles, and thanks of course to you. If you'd like to make any comments on the show, please do find me on LinkedIn. That's where I love to communicate with people. And if you have anybody in mind for a guest on an upcoming show, someone that's changed the world in some way, could be big, could be small, could be kind of random, by all means, do put us in touch with one another and we'll see where we go. If you haven't already, do check out the archive. We've had some fantastic guests. Hit that subscribe button. My name's Ian Hawkins. Have a great time. Till the next time.